Welcome, friends. This is Dr. Gracie Christie of the Catholic Association, and I'm pleased to bring you this bonus episode of Conversations with Consequences. Our legal eagle, Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, recently joined Timothy Uhl, who is the Superintendent of Montana Catholic Schools, on his podcast, Catholic School Matters, and kindly gave us permission to post the full audio here on our podcast feed. Be sure to check out the podcast show notes for the link to Dr. Uhl's podcast. Now, without further ado, here's Andrea and Dr. Uhl in a discussion about an extremely important court case that will affect Catholic schools in Montana. Enjoy and be on the lookout for the regular episode of Conversations with Consequences this Friday.
My guest now is Andrea Picciotti-Bayer. I think I got that mostly right.
You did it beautifully. That was great.
The legal advisor for the Catholic Association. Thanks for joining me, Andrea.
It's wonderful to be here with you.
So we started connecting via email because your organization, maybe you, wrote the amicus brief in support of the Espinosa case, correct?
Yes, and you and a number of your colleagues out in Montana were fantastic in connecting me with beautiful families that are benefiting or have benefited from Catholic schools in the state. So it was great. It's great to finally be talking to you.
So let's talk about making sure people understand what an amicus brief is. My understanding is it's sort of like a friend of the court document that supports the legal arguments of one side or the other. Is that correct?
Absolutely, it is. And as you know, you're Latin. Amicus comes from the Latin of friend. And the courts are looking for different perspectives, and they invite different groups to come in and be able to not only expand upon the legal issues, but really help give some texture to the case. In this case, 30 amicus briefs were filed in support of Espinosa, and the United States filed a brief also in support. So it's really an incredible showing of interest and concern.
What is that typical of a Supreme Court case, or is that more than usual?
You know, it's a good gauge of when a case is a pretty important case for the court and for clarifying a legal issue. Normally, you'll get maybe you can count them on your hand. But when a case is a big deal case, like I believe Espinosa is, you're going to get these kinds of numbers.
And this is 30 on both sides? So there were some people for or against, or?
No, right now, the Espinosa has filed what's called their brief on the merits. And so the 30 briefs plus the United States is in support of Espinosa. In November, on November 8th, the state, the Montana Department of Revenue is going to be filing their brief in response. And there will likely be a number of amicus briefs in support of their position as well.
Okay, very good. So this is part of what you do, is you sort of watch the landscape, the legal landscape, and then swoop in and write an amicus brief in support of the cases that you want to support, right?
Well, and swooping is beautifully graphic.
I've got my arms out right now. Swooping.
It's really, I'm flying. A colleague of mine calls me the legal eagle, so I think swooping is a perfect descriptor.
Yeah.
Our organization, we filed a number of briefs where the church really has a stake in a case that's involved, and some of them have been. One was a case heard in the Supreme Court involving pro-life pregnancy centers. And as you know, a lot of Catholics and Catholic institutions are supporting mothers facing challenging pregnancies in these centers. That case, the Supreme Court agreed with our perspective that these pregnancy centers shouldn't be forced to promote abortion services that the state had. We've also filed briefs in the lower courts of appeals and in support of the Supreme Court hearing cases involving Catholic-run foster care and adoption programs.
So how many?
We're waiting.
How many will you write in a typical year?
That's a great question. They're pretty intensive because the briefs that we're contributing are unique in that they're story briefs. In addition to legal arguments, we're bringing in kind of a human side of the case, and the amici, the people that join our organization, are regular people, and so it's sharing their stories on how this case implicates something that's very important to them, either something that they're involved with personally, like in this case, parents who have kids in Catholic schools, or something that they benefited. So in the foster care case, we interviewed a number of former foster children that are now adults, and they really wanted to make sure that Catholic foster care placement agencies continue to be able to work in their communities because their lives were changed because of that offering. So I would say, as far as the numbers question, 2 or 3 a year is probably my standard. I wish I could do more, but these are complicated and important cases that we really want to do right.
So in this particular case, you got involved because, my guess is, I guess I haven't asked you this question before, but my guess is that you really see this as a significant case that could overturn Blaine Amendments, right?
Absolutely. I think it's the case. And I'm somewhat disappointed that a couple years ago the court had the chance to get rid of the Blaine Amendments in a case called Trinity Lutheran, and they didn't.
That was the tire stuff on the playground.
The scrap tire recycling program in a preschool playground in Missouri, and they didn't quite kind of lay the Blaine Amendments to rest. The Espinosa case is the chance for the court to finally do away with them, and First, as a practicing Catholic and as a lawyer defending the interests of the Catholic Church and of Catholics in America, the history, the anti-Catholic history of Blaine Amendments is something that is, it just gets me upset. I'm also a civil rights lawyer by experience, and it's really an affront to the fair treatment of Americans, especially people that are what we call religious exercising people who religion is an important part of their daily life and their decision making. So it's a great chance to do away with that, and also to highlight the good that the church, particularly Catholic schools, are doing for the country and for real families.
What do you call in the legal world when you try to understand the original intent of the people who framed a law? What do you call that?
Well, there's a move when you're talking about it as in constitutional law.
Yeah.
There is originalism is one of the words that's thrown about, and the late Justice Scalia was a big proponent of originalism, and it's looking at the intent of the people. There's also something called textualism, and that's another kind of a way of analyzing the law, and it's looking at the words that are written in the law. What do these words actually mean, not reading more into it in light of what's happened since then. The Blaine case, you don't really have to guess as far as what was going on. It's flat out anti-Catholic bigotry that now is morphing into an anti-religious discrimination.
I know that you don't have to guess when you look at the actual law, but in practice, I think in the field, we see this sort of, well, there's separation, like what I always hear is, well, there's separation between church and state. And I always want to say, well, I think you're forgetting why there was originally separation of church and state. There's originally separation of church and state to protect the church, not to protect the state from this awful, religion. And it's like, I don't know.
Well, and that's a really important thing to clarify, I think, for most people. First, the notion of separation from church and state wasn't what the founders envisioned. When they came up with what's called the two religion clauses, one is free exercise, and one is the establishment clause. So in the Constitution, there is a prohibition at the federal level from establishing a church. So we're not going to have the Church of the United States. Right. And that's really a pluralism clause, in my opinion. It's to try to allow for the rich pluralism that really we enjoy today, that there can be numerous denominations and, Christian and non-Christian, and there's this vitality that comes in our religious pluralism. But at the same time, there's this really important part, and that's the individual aspect or a collective aspect of freedom of religion. And so when we talk about not endorsing an established religion, it's not to say that the country needs to be devoid of religion. The founders really saw that religion, and especially living out religion's faith, a person's faith, made the populace more virtuous. It made our civic society better. And so what we're trying to do is kind of, I think now the courts and the Supreme Court is really trying to clarify, and this last term had an important case dealing with a monument, a cross, celebrating World War I veterans. And our country is made better by the presence of religion.
So if we looked into your crystal ball and said the best possible outcome is doing away with all Blaine amendments, but let's go beyond that and say, well, what does that look like? Are we talking about years and years of state level legal battles, or is there a way that you see this is the impact it's going to have immediately?
Montana's case is a perfect example. The Montana legislature decided that for the good of the residents and the kids especially, it'd be a great thing to allow for greater parental choice in education. And it wasn't, and at the same time, they came up with a scholarship tax credit program for people that wanted to support scholarships to private schools. And they also gave tax credits to people that wanted to give money to their public schools. And that's something that's somewhat forgotten in this case. It's driven at the state level. How are we going to make a better future for our kids? If the Blaine amendments are out of the way, you get that kind of creativity. And the closer you get to the local level, the more precise it can be to address the needs of real families. And so I think what can happen is when the Blaine amendments, which are at these, state level, 37 states have some kind of Blaine amendment, are taken out of the equation, there's going to be incredible creativity and incredible wins for kids in the U.S.
So they would be like immediately.
So my crystal ball is.
Would it be? Let me just ask this practical question. So the Blaine Amendment that's found in the Montana, and in fairness, people should know that when we talk about Blaine amendments, originating in the 1850s or early 19th century, the Montana Constitution was rewritten in 1973. So it's like this is a relic of a relic of a relic. That it continues. Would you say then immediately that is sort of deemed unconstitutional at the federal level, and so therefore all the rules have to be rewritten?
Yes, we know that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land.
Yeah.
Right, and even though there's a great sense of respecting state constitutions, no state constitution can be unconstitutional from the federal perspective. And so what I really think, getting down to kind of brass tacks, if you get rid of these limiting Blaine amendments from the states that have them, there are tons of state legislatures and people that want school choice, that want great vitality and participation of religious institutions in, partnering with the government. If you get rid of the Blaine amendments, you can allow for that. So in the school context, it's going to allow for greater creativity, whether it's vouchers or tax credits, and that helps both recognize parental choice in making the best decision for your kid. It also helps public schools because competition is the great energizer. And so there's a really great opportunity in the school context. But as we've got more and more social problems that need partnership between local and state governments, faith-based organizations are some of the best partners. So if you get the Blaine amendments out of the way, we're going to see a lot more cooperative work among the church communities and their local and state governments.
I think that's a project, though, that needs to be done, which is sort of imagining the landscape without Blaine amendments. And I don't know if people have really, because I think the worry people have is, so let's just take Montana. Well, let me say the worry people have is there's going to be endless legal battles that are going to take place on those sort of local or state levels. For instance, so this week, I know this is going to drop probably in November, but we're a couple of days before our Catholic Teacher Days, which we do every other year. Okay. And this year we contracted with Vax Education Solutions to come in and run our event. And so our event is, according to the Montana Constitution, it's secular. So we don't have religion topics for the actual Catholic Teacher Days, so people can earn continuing education credits and so forth. Okay. Schools started submitting title funding requests to their LEAs, and they were denied. And we finally were like, why is this being denied? And people said, because you have Catholic in the name. Like, it's the most ridiculous thing. And I was on the phone with somebody. I said, did you actually read the schedule, like to look at the actual sessions? Because just because Catholic is in the name doesn't mean that it isn't,
Well, and you make a really good point, and it's kind of bringing us back to the Trinity Lutheran case. They were resurfacing a preschool playground. It wasn't anything dealing, and it was a Lutheran church sponsored the preschool. And Chief Justice Roberts at the time said this kind of discrimination, because the Lutheran schools petition for a grant was denied just because it was Lutheran.
Right.
And Chief Justice Roberts said this kind of discrimination is, quote, odious to our Constitution. It's treating religious organizations or religious people as second-class citizens, and that's not permissive under the Constitution, and it's not good. It's not sound social policy either.
Right.
So if teachers want to develop their professional skills at Catholic teacher formation, they should. And no one would think that individual choice to benefit is somehow a government endorsement of Catholicism, or the Catholic Church becomes, the Church of Montana.
Yeah. Well, this is great.
So I think you're right to be incensed about it, and I think that this kind of clarification from the Supreme Court is something that will benefit not only Montana, but all the other states and the legislatures that are really trying to create kind of more opportunities out there.
Yeah. Well, Andrea, I really appreciate this. This is a good piece. I think it's going to fit in with the other pieces of this podcast, because we're talking about amicus briefs. We even talked about originalism and textualism. That's great. Separation of church and state. And just kind of really giving people a sense of what and the Blaine amendments are and what that would look like. So I'm going to try it again. Andrea Picciotti-Bayer.
Fantastic.
From the
Congratulations.
Catholic Association. You have a podcast. Do you want to promote your podcast?
We do. I promote my podcast at every turn. It's called Conversations with Consequences. We are on Apple Podcasts,
Sounds
Spotify,
really important.
wherever you
that
can
means
get
if
it.
you say the wrong thing, you can get kicked off the show?
No. It's you just consequential.
Oh. Catholic survivor, just keep...
It's been really, no, we don't kick anyone off the show. We just keep calling people back in. They're like repeat offenders. It's a super fun podcast. It's really trying to kind of be maybe like Fresh Air or The View with formation.
And you're one of the hosts?
I am like the Ed McMahon to one of my colleagues, Gracie Christie, Dr. Gracie Christie, who's a medical doctor, and our other colleagues at the Catholic Association, a legislative expert, Maureen Ferguson, and incredible millennial, Ashley McGuire. So we're hoping to have an Espinosa-themed episode as we get closer to oral argument, which will likely be either at the end of the year or the beginning of next year.
Okay.
And if you can come on, that would be great.
And we'll do it all in Spanish, because I'm sure you and Gracie can speak Spanish, right?
No, estamos completamente bilingües.
I'm just kidding. My Spanish is terrible. But I could understand what you're saying. But I was noticing that she grew up in Mexico. Well, Andrea, thanks. Can you hold on the line just a second? I wanted to talk to you one more thing. But Andrea, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much.